Welcome back, everybody. We're going to do the second half for Britain's Bloodiest Day, the Battle of the Somme. Where we left off was essentially the explanation where Britain's using shrapnel shells and it's not getting rid of barbed wire. And so when Britain sends these waves of men over the top, whistles blow, they go over the top. There are still obstacles in the way that the soldiers can't get through, and it sort of makes them sitting ducks. That's where we left off. This isn't, I talked about this in part one. This is not specific to Britain. The Battle of Somme obviously is a rough go for Britain, but every side in World War I has major problems with trying to get their head around the new type of warfare that the world was now had at their door. And so because of that, you see all of these attempts to try these slightly different variations, essentially of things that just didn't work. They were still built basically on the blocks of what old warfare used to look like, and this was just an entirely new and different thing, and it was going to take entirely new and different strategies in order to make it successful. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Britain's Bloodiest Day, Battle of the Somme. This is the second half.
Many military historians argue that had they instead focused on firing high explosive shells, then they would have had much greater effectiveness, and the first day of the Somme battle might have been very different. Finally, and perhaps most seriously, British shells suffered an appalling failure rate. As many as 30% of the shells fired in the week leading up to their offensive failed to detonate upon impact, leaving them
They were not shell manufacturers. So this eventually gets fixed, and you have David Lloyd George that comes in. I believe it was him that came in and took over armaments production. But essentially at the beginning of the war, Britain is scrambling. And you actually see this exact same thing take place in the U.S. once they declare war and get involved. They are not prepared for war either. Or at least they're not prepared for war on this scale. So what happens is you have these manufacturing companies that are manufacturing basically everything except for arms and munitions. All sorts of stuff all across the board, household items, all sorts of stuff. And they immediately are brought in to make arms and ammunition. And of course, they sort of suck at it. But what is Britain going to do? They can't not have it. And going into this war, people are thinking the amount of shells that they have and are thinking they would use are not even close to what they actually need and will actually use. And so you have to have the shells. Eventually, this sort of gets sorted out, and Britain's not a massive land power anyway. It's not like they have all this space and all these factories and all these people that are just all over the place, like, say, Russia or something like that. It's a little bit of a different task. And so, yeah, their armaments production certainly early on is not, it's not that great.
buried in the mud in no man's land, their warheads still armed. Yet despite these reports, Haig and his senior officers still believed the bombardment would yield the required results before the morning of July 1st. Before nightfall on June 30th, the British and French troops billeted behind the front lines were ordered to muster and then begin marching to their comrades who had been manning the frontline trenches. Those scheduled to follow in later waves lined the roadsides and leaned out of houses and barns that acted as their barracks, cheering them on, and many wishing they were going with them. Captain Neville carried one of the East Surrey's footballs with him, promising to kick the ball at the German line as soon as the attack began. As they approached the trenches, some of them noticed German observation balloons tethered behind their own lines and knew that if they could see them, ominously floating there in the sky, then the German observers could see the British soldiers marching towards the front line, meaning they would surely realize the attack was imminent. Whether related or not to these balloons, German artillery had been in action that day, reminding the British that they were still a threat. A deadly hit on number 11 platoon of the Ulster Regiment killed or wounded 42 men, leaving behind just 6 survivors, one of whom was deemed so shell-shocked by the experience that he had to be evacuated that evening. After what was no doubt an anxious and restless night for the 14 British divisions and 6 French divisions, under a fairly pleasant-looking sky, they settled into
God, look at that guy on the bottom left.
breakfast early the next day, hoping food might settle the nerves. For some, it did the opposite, causing them to vomit from the adrenaline surging through their bodies. Officers checked their watches periodically as the minutes counted down to 730 hours, at which time the offensive would begin, following the detonation of the underground mines. Some units had already dug narrow trenches out into no man's land for them to use when the attack came, hoping to limit the time they would be exposed to enemy fire, and these were now being filled with troops who planned to dash at the German forces before they could organize a defense once the artillery stopped. The mines were timed to go off within just a few minutes of the advance beginning, so that the British troops weren't caught up in the astonishing blasts. However, the mine at the Hawthorne Redoubt was detonated a full 10 minutes prior. This was on the orders of Lieutenant General Hunter Weston, commander of the British 8th Corps, who wanted the resulting crater to be an objective for his men to capture, providing them with cover from German counterattacks. When the mine detonated at 720 hours on July 1st, it was the largest man-made explosion in history at that time, sending huge amounts of dirt and rock flying through the air. The sound was so loud, it was reportedly heard across the Channel on the outskirts of London. However, upon sighting this explosion on their lines, the Germans also realized that the attack was about to begin, and German officers and NCOs ordered their men out of their protective dugouts and into position. Soon after, the other mines were detonated, and then at 730 hours, whistles began to be blown all along the British lines, signaling the attack to begin. Some units had already left their trenches, hoping that the last few minutes of the artillery barrage on the first trench line would allow them to get close enough to the German lines to attack before the Germans could properly organize themselves, the artillery then switching to the secondary German line. Recalling what happened next, Lieutenant Alfred Bundy of the 2nd Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment of the 8th Division, said, "Went over the top after an indeterminate period of terrible apprehension. Our artillery seemed to increase in intensity, and the German guns opened up on no man's land. The din was deafening, the fumes choking, and visibility limited owing to the dust and clouds caused by exploding shells. It was a veritable inferno. I was momentarily expecting to be blown to pieces. My platoon continued to advance in good order without many casualties, and had reached halfway to the Boche line. Suddenly, an appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened against us, and my men commenced to fall. I shouted, 'Down!' but most of those that were still not hit had already taken cover. I dropped in a shell hole, and occasionally attempted to move to my right and left, but bullets were forming an impenetrable barrage, and exposure of the head meant certain death. None of our men were visible, but in all directions came pitiful groans and cries of pain. The illusion of being able to walk into the devastated German lines was shattered in just minutes. Bundy's story was repeated time and time again with other units who found themselves trying to find any cover from the hail of lead being thrown at them. Even when they could find themselves able to move, many of them found that as they approached the German lines, they were bottlenecked into the few gaps in the barbed wire that had been successfully blown open by the preliminary barrage. Here.
Yeah, I think I talked about this in the first part, about there being these little small gaps in the barbed wire, in the defensive works. Essentially, that's where everybody has to go. And so you kind of funnel everybody into these small groups. And the machine gun just changes so much about this entire conflict. It changes so much. I mean, it takes away cavalry charges, basically. Cavalry is essentially useless because of the machine gun. If you don't, if a line breaks for all of history, that's when all of the, essentially that's when all the death happens. A line breaks, one side starts a rout, and then the cavalry comes and swoops in behind them and takes everybody out, and that's when casualties start to mount. Well, consider that you're in a cavalry regiment, right? You're sort of waiting on the side, and an enemy line breaks and runs for it. If you swoop in, they don't have to be retreating in good order to turn around with the machine gun and just lace everything in front of them. And so there really is no use for the cavalry, because even a routing army can take a cavalry regiment out in the snap of a finger. Just so much changes because of the machine gun and its prevalence on the front line. But imagine that you're in that guy's shoes, right? You do what you're supposed to do. You go over the top. You get your guys out there. You realize, and everybody around you realizes, that there is still a ton of German troops, certainly enough to pin down any oncoming British soldiers. So you take cover. Everybody that in your group that hasn't gotten hit takes cover. What the hell do? You have cover in the precise spot that you're in, but there's machine gun fire all over the place. There's rifle fire all over the place, and there are shell explosions all over the place. So you're sort of trapped here. You're going to have to be very careful to even be able to make it out of this situation alive, even though you didn't immediately die upon going over the top like a ton of other troops did.
Scores of men were mown down as the German machine gunners focused their fire on these choke points. Captain Neville of the East Surrey Regiment was observed kicking his football just as he climbed out of his trench, his men close behind. The East Surreys made it to the German lines before getting caught in the undamaged barbed wire. Neville was last seen alive organizing his men's effort to bypass the wire when he was shot and killed. The survivors of the East Surrey Regiment left the football entangled in the wire that had stopped them. In the PALS battalions, where everyone knew everyone else personally from before the war, the horror was unimaginable, as men watched friends and even family members killed before their very eyes.
And not just that, we've talked about the PALS battalions a couple of different times, but entire areas back at home will lose large amounts of their male population because of this. It seems like a good recruiting tactic to have everybody, you can actually serve with your friends and family that you come and sign up with. But, it's a double-edged sword, because when one of those regiments gets wiped out, it's very consolidated in a very specific area of Britain.
Private J. Elliott of the 20th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers saw the uncle of the unit's piper killed in front of him, saying, "He was riddled with bullets, writhing and screaming. Another lad was just kneeling, his head thrown right back. Bullets were just slapping into him, knocking great bloody chunks off his body." Yet, despite the bloodbath, through sheer force of numbers, British troops began to reach the German lines. Disoriented by the detonation of the Hawthorne mine, a German officer named Eichler, who commanded a machine gun team, found himself and his men confronted by the terrifying sight of waves of British troops descending on their position. One of his men explained the scene later. The explosion of the mine had blown both gun and team sprawling into the bottom of their firing bay. By the time they resumed their fire position, the nearest attackers had penetrated the German position and were only 20 meters away. The gun opened fire, but jammed after 10 rounds. After this stoppage had been cleared, only another 10 rounds were fired before it jammed again. "Back," ordered Eichler, grabbing the gun and rushing into the next traverse. Here, the stoppage was finally cleared, and the gun began to fire at point-blank range at the attackers, who fell dead and wounded into the trench. Eichler himself added, "The bullets fired by our machine gunners and riflemen smashed like a hurricane into their bunched-up ranks. Some of our men climbed up onto our parapets and threw hand grenades at those attackers who were lying on the ground. In less than a minute, the battlefield seemed to be deserted." The offensive had barely begun, and already the number of casualties was enormous. The situation was not helped by the fact that, with the men having been slowed by stiff German resistance, the artillery which was intended to suppress German forces immediately ahead of their position began to outrun them, leaving them behind on their own. Nevertheless, the British and French began to see some progress being made. The 36th Ulster Regiment captured the Schwaben Redoubt, but without support on either side of their flanks, they were forced to retreat in the afternoon amidst a German counterattack. To the south of the 36th, the 32nd successfully captured the Leipzig Redoubt, while the 34th Division successfully captured the crater left behind by the detonation of a British mine known as Lochnagar. In the northern sectors, the British Third Army struck out towards Gommecourt, the intention being that they were to divert German attention away from the main thrust carried out by the Fourth Army. However, it proved an almost complete failure, as men were killed in their hundreds by German machine gun teams. This despite the use of trenches being dug closer to the German lines to limit the distance across no man's land. In some areas, progress was not only halted by German wire, but unexploded British shells and mortar bombs from the preceding barrage. A portion of the German trench line was captured before German artillery made sending reinforcements across no man's land impossible, and much of the territory was recovered in the afternoon as a result of a German bombardment. By the day's end, the British had lost 6 men for every 1 German killed in this arena. Moving south along the front line, the German positions collapsed under the British and French advance. The British 7th and 21st Division, despite facing stiff opposition, successfully captured Memmets, which cut off the Germans in the fortified village of Fricourt, forcing them to abandon it to the Allied troops. East of their position, the 18th and 30th Divisions successfully captured the village of Montauban. Further south along the Allied line, the veteran French units enjoyed considerable success as they struck out on either side of the Somme River. The Germans hadn't anticipated the offensive to take place so far south, and their defensive positions were less well prepared. Also, the French army's artillery proved far more effective than the British in the build-up to the attack, possessing heavier weapons which did greater damage to the barbed wire. Breaking through the German lines, the French 30 Corps achieved their Day 1 objectives north of the Somme and succeeded in capturing 2,500 German prisoners. The French colonial troops south of the river also reached their objectives and captured a further 3,000 troops. With so much...
These are basically... So World War I, especially when you're reading about it, it's sort of hard to get your head around because the casualty numbers for battles and even just daily totals are just so absurd that eventually it sort of starts to run together, which I've talked about this before. That's one of the reasons why I don't really like to read history from the 10,000-foot armchair general view, because I feel like it sort of loses its humanity. It loses the reality of the situation on the ground some. However, in the best scenarios of most of the war, the best attack plans for most of the war, this is what it looks like. So the British have an absurd amount of casualties, and you're like, yeah, there's success here, different parts of the line near the Somme, and you're reaching Day 1 objectives and things of that nature, but they get ground down. And eventually, this is sort of Ludendorff's whole thing of defense in depth. His whole big thing becomes like, yeah, sure, we will gladly trade land for blood, essentially, like as terrible as that sounds. We'll give up land in order to kill more troops. It's sort of a devastating, harsh reality of the situation. But even in the very best scenarios for most of this conflict, even these somewhat successful Day 1 attacks, they just get ground down after a handful of days.
Much bloodshed taking place. Both sides agreed to brief truces in order to recover their dead from no man's land. One of those given this unpleasant task was 25-year-old Lance Corporal Rupert Whiteman of the 10th Royal Fusiliers. Describing the scene, he recalled later, "It was a nauseating job. The things that had once been men were rotting after being left out too long in the hot sun. There was no removing of private papers or identity discs, no respectful arranging of limbs. They are not sons of mothers to us, they were just things, without personality, carrion to be removed from sight in the shortest possible time." Many men like Whiteman took to smoking cigarettes as they carried out the gruesome task to help calm their nerves, and to conceal the smell of their dead comrades. At their headquarters, Field Marshal Haig's commanders struggled to piece together the exact picture of what was happening on the front line. It was becoming clear that they were not going to achieve their planned goals for the day, and so orders were given to continue the advance into the next day. Meanwhile, the Germans were busily preparing their own major counterattack. They had planned for it to take place in the late evening, but it was ultimately delayed until the following morning. What no one would appreciate as July 1st, 1916 wound down, however, was the sheer scale of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Not until later would the casualty figures for such a meager day's progress be appreciated. In the south, the French suffered over 1,500 men dead and 5,500 wounded. The Germans, meanwhile, lost 12,000 men killed, captured, or wounded, but the British suffered a staggering 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240, nearly a third, were killed. It was, and remains, the deadliest day in the history of the British Army.
Those are kids. Those are kids. Man, I've seen here and there in some of this video, guys that are on the younger side, but man, those look like children.
Context, in 2022, the entire strength of the British Army stands at 79,380 full-time personnel. While there would never be as bloody a day again, for the survivors of that first horrendous attack, it was merely the beginning of a campaign that would battle on for 141 days. After fending off the German counterattacks, additional Allied assaults resulted in a further 25,000 casualties by July 13th. Eventually, the Battle of the Somme deteriorated down to a series of pitched engagements with specific objectives designed to wear down the Germans and allow the breakthrough Haig envisioned. On July 14th, 4 British divisions made a dawn attack on Longueville Bridge, supported by an intense artillery bombardment, successfully catching the German defenders by surprise and securing it by midday. Apparently, having learned from their earlier mistakes, British and French forces succeeded in eroding the German forces in the Somme region through August and into September, the Germans finding themselves lacking the level of supplies and reinforcements enjoyed by their opponents. Then on September 15th, 1916, the British unleashed something the Germans had never seen before that would prove a true game-changer. It was the British secret weapon, the tank. The Germans had little that could fend off these armored Goliaths trundling towards them, and they advanced one...
Yeah, what the hell do you even, like... Well, what do you even think if you're a German in the trench and you see that? Well, I don't even know what your thought process would be. Just wild. And as you may know or at least expect, Haig is not... He is certainly one of the leaders who there are some rough words for him by contemporaries at the time, which, like I say, I try to give the benefit of the doubt historically to political leaders and military leaders, but World War I is one of those conflicts where, man, it is hard in a lot of cases to try to give that benefit of the doubt, because you're sort of just slamming your head into a wall going like you're doing the same thing over and over and over and losing, just throwing lives away by the tens of thousands every time you do it. Come on.
0.5 miles behind the German lines before they had to retreat. A relatively spectacular debut, but one that was not built upon. Given the huge losses taken in the Somme region, there was a rush to fill the spaces left in the British units. With numbers being the name of the game, many of the PALS battalions found themselves reinforced with men who hailed from all over Great Britain, rather than their local communities. As such, these recruits found it difficult to integrate into their ranks, especially given that many of them were now hardened veterans. Additionally, these non-local men saw the regional identities of these new units eventually eroded away, becoming just another uniform unit. On November 18th, 1916, with the winter weather now biting into the French landscape, Haig decided enough was enough and called off further offensives. The Allies had only advanced 7 miles, hardly a breakthrough, although the Germans had suffered 450,000 casualties. This came at the appalling cost of 420 British Empire casualties and over 200,000 French. Despite the meagre gains, the cost to the Germans and the prevention of the fall of Verdun meant that the Somme was considered an Allied victory. However, it is one that has left the British people especially feeling as stung as though it were defeat.
Okay, so that is, or was, Britain's bloodiest day, the Battle of the Somme. Really, really rough. World War I as a whole is just brutal, brutal. And as I've said 100 times on this channel, I don't understand how the guys who survived it came back home and continued to live normal lives. It's almost inconceivable to think that they were just sort of expected to go back to what they were before the war after experiencing this. David Gibbs, I believe, has written a book over this, and it goes into some of the things that the frontline troop had to experience on the British side. And yeah, it's just brutal, just brutal. Great video. Really liked this one. I will check out some other videos from this channel. What was it? Wars of the World, I believe. And see if there's any more that I can find on there that I would like to do. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. Any comments you have, anything like that, put it down in the comments below. Or you could join the Discord. I'll put the link in the description box down below. And I'll see you all next time.